beautiful June day, and we did start recording, so I hope that's all right with everyone. And if if you want to turn your video off, if you're concerned about that, please do. But I would just ask everyone to mute themselves as we start to dig in. But people are coming on, but I think we'll just get started. There's a lot to cover, and we want to end promptly at 1. So thanks for joining us. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the Climate Action Plan and how these two important processes connect. I think you're clearly well aware that Vermont's embarking on these two important planning efforts, and we're going to get into a significant level of detail about what's happening in both of these arenas and how they interrelate. We are joined today by TJ Poor, who is the Director of Efficiency and Energy Resources at the Vermont Department of Public Service. Thank you, TJ, for joining us and lending your time and all your work. And we're also joined today by Jane Lazorchek, who's the Director of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is housed in the Agency of Natural Resources. TJ and Jane are, in just a moment, are going to be sort of a 1-2 punch overviewing. We're going to hear first from TJ about an update on the work underway to update the Comprehensive Energy Plan. Many of you were probably deeply involved in the, the last planning process, which, as we all know, set the 90 by 2050 total renewable energy goal in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and outlined as many strategies to make progress towards that important goal. So TJ is going to provide an update on that work underway, as well as pretty much, I think, almost hot off the presses, an overview of the scenarios that the Public Service Department is modeling for the Comprehensive Energy Plan, as well as for the Climate Action Plan. Then we're going to hear from Jane, who's leading the Global Warming Solutions Act efforts and the coordination of the Climate Council, more about the Climate Council's work, what's happening, the significant amount of work happening right now in the 5 subcommittees, as well as, really importantly, the public engagement efforts that are underway. So we're going to dig into a couple of presentations from TJ and Jane momentarily. But really importantly, we definitely are going to have ample time for questions and answers. Hope to get to as many as possible. So if you have, questions, comments, please put them in the chat. And again, at the end of the presentations, we'll aim to really try to get as many of those questions answered for you. So this is really timely conversation. The Public Service Department, I think, has begun their public engagement on the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and culminating, I think, on June 28th with the final initial public engagement forum held with the regional planning commissions and other partners. Probably hear a little bit more about that from TJ. But I really just want to turn it over to TJ and Jane, and first to TJ, to set a little bit more context for us all about the work happening on the CEP, as we call it for short, and the CAP, the Climate Action Plan, as we now call that for short, because they are deeply interrelated and really important sort of blueprints for the progress we know we need to make in Vermont, and the opportunity that progress provides when we're talking about jobs and equity and resilience and public health, all kinds of really important benefits from doing our part on climate. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to TJ and give us an update on all the work that you are up to. And I'll turn it over to both of you for the overview. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. And TJ, take it away.
Thanks, Joey. And thanks everybody for coming. And Joey, thank you VNRC for hosting. Looks to be a really, really good turnout. And we really appreciate VNRC offering to engage your network. Really excited to engage with this network, because often you all on the call and your friends and partners are the ones who are much closer to seeing some of the on-the-ground implementation challenges as we look ahead to the next 5 and 10 years and opportunities for the long-term energy future. So as Joey said, today I'm going to describe the basis for the development and the process for the Comprehensive Energy Plan, and then Jane will go on to do the same for the Global Warming Solutions Act Climate Action Plan. If you could go to the next slide, Becca. So I'd like to start talking about the energy plan by going back to Vermont's statutory state energy policy, which is embodied in 30 VSA 202A, but really all the work that our office does as both the ratepayer advocate and the state energy office is in service to this energy policy. And on this slide, some of the fundamental principles of energy policy are highlighted here, like adequacy, reliability, sustainability, affordability, and cost effectiveness, and achieving greenhouse gas reduction requirements. And obviously, these requirements can be competing. They sometimes bump up against each other. And the energy plan is really intended to try and balance these objectives to chart a path for our energy future. And it's not represented on the slide here, but there's a lot of, just acknowledging that there's a lot of other statutes that really inform state energy policy, whether they're energy efficiency or renewable energy, least cost planning, but really umbrella is embodied here in the broad state energy policy. So next slide, please. So the Comprehensive Energy Plan is really, it's really actually two plans. So many years the requirement was just electric plan and electric plan. So how do you meet the needs of reliable electric service at least cost? And that's still a core component of the energy plan, and particularly important, obviously, as given the amount of the fossil fuel conversion to electric technologies and space heating and transportation that's already happening. But in the last 10 to 15 years, this is, the electric plan requirement was expanded to be comprehensive and to meet all of Vermont's energy needs. And to do this, it really necessitates the department not being the only state government agency engaged in its development. So while we're nominally the lead, it's really a broad effort engaging Agency of Natural Resources, Agency of Transportation, Commerce, Health, buildings and general services, et cetera. It's really a partnership across agencies. Next slide, please. So as we do it, there are certain requirements that the energy plan must address. Mentioned greenhouse gas reduction requirements before. Those are actually now set in statute by the Global Warming Solutions Act, as many of you probably know. We'll get into more detail of that later. The energy plan must also include standards and recommendations for enhanced energy planning for municipalities and regional planning commissions. So that it's intended to provide a clear guide for how local governments can plan their energy future. The energy planning for munis and RPCs was really a new thing last time we published the plan, but now the energy plan lays out a framework for those local governments to plan, and they, if they follow that framework and have their plan approved, then those plans actually receive substantial deference in Public Utility Commission proceedings, and particularly related to siting. So an important part of the plan. Next slide. So just really briefly, Joey mentioned our last CEP has a target of 90% renewable energy across all sectors by 2050. That was set back in 2016. And the plan also really included, it's really, 400-page document that has a lot of information in it. Also has over 300 recommendations scattered throughout as to how we could push the state in that direction of 90% renewable by 2050. Next slide. And that really is, for this plan, the 2022 plan, a starting point. So 90% by 2050, we're not backsliding from that. That's just our starting point. And the other starting point is, again, the greenhouse gas reduction requirements. So these two core pieces that we will be aiming to achieve. And the plan is intended to create a vision for how to reach those targets and requirements. Next slide. So what is that vision? I mentioned that there's 300 recommendations in the last energy plan. There was a lot of meat in those recommendations, but they were kind of scattershot. And so the department is hoping that to frame this version of the energy plan as a strategic plan, more of a strategic plan, where we describe how the state thinks about trade-offs among policies, how we value costs and benefits in analyzing what's good policy for Vermont and then applying that. And when I say costs and benefits, I don't just mean economic costs and benefits. I mean that in a broader sense. We're also planning to consider more explicitly milestones. For example, when's a policy or program no longer likely to be effective? How will we know? For example, if all vehicle manufacturers are selling electric vehicles in, say, 2035, what does that mean for an incentive policy for new electric vehicles? Recognizing that there's will still be a lot of used vehicles at that time. How do we adjust to really continue to push towards those 2050 goals, and what do we evaluate when doing that? And that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but ultimately we want the plan to be robust in the face of uncertainty. For example, if there was a global pandemic, how real adaptable is the plan? The plan will also include the Act 174, that's the Enhanced Energy Planning Standards and Recommendations, Climate and Renewable Pathways, and it will, as it usually does, include the state's Lead by Example Plan, the State Agency Energy Plan for government operations. Next slide. So one of the first steps in developing the plan is we like to do some modeling to understand what we expect to happen if we do nothing, and then pathways to reach our targets. And this is not new. Even before the last energy plan was started, we completed what we called then a total energy study that mapped the policy and technology pathways to reach 90 by 2050. This is a similar effort in partnership with the Department of Environmental Conservation and A&R and with the Climate Council to conduct modeling for the energy plan and greenhouse gas mitigation analysis. This slide describes a little bit the low emissions analysis platform, which was developed by the Stockholm Environment Institute. Importantly, this model is in what I'm calling an open model or open source, even if that's not a true definition of the word. But really, the model, when it's done, it's provided to the state along with training for state agencies to continue to have access and conduct future analysis on our own and track our progress towards requirements as we go. I was involved in the last total energy study, and we had a fancy model called the Times Markel model. It was really good. It even probably had a few more bells and whistles than the LEAP model, but it was a little bit black box-ish, to be honest. And it wasn't something that the state could actually use going forward. So it provided one report and a really good result. Ultimately, we actually used LEAP to help our regional planning commissions and municipalities move, apply that statewide model to be more regional in nature and understand the impacts in their own, within their own borders. And so I'm really excited about this model and that capability that we're going to bring to the state to not only have the energy plan and the climate action plan be a one-time modeling effort, but to allow it to evolve over time and track our policies. And I think I mentioned that the Climate Council is going to use this. This was just early on. This department and A&R had gotten started with the LEAP modeling and recognizing that we didn't want to have two similar models reporting two similar but different outcomes. The Climate Council adopted the LEAP modeling effort to help inform its findings as well. And before I leave this, I'll just note that a description of the early results of the business as usual reference case can actually be found on the Climate Council's website. It was presented last week to the Science and Data Subcommittee. So folks want to look there for that. And I can talk about that more if there's questions. Next slide. So this is my last slide for now, is just to go over the timeline a little bit. And on here I have as of last week, I guess. It is continually evolving, the timeline, as we learn more and understand what we can do, and as we coordinate with the Climate Council. Back in December, we issued a request for input that was really related to kind of how we should model, how we should think about the model, what type of scenarios we should build in to our contract with SEI. We're started with engagement on the modeling. That's mainly taken the form of those Climate Council feedback, and also with other state agencies. In June through August, so this month through August, we are conducting regional forums. As Joey mentioned, these are really for us to get input from the RPCs and from municipalities on what implementation challenges they're seeing, and what we could do to help set up those guidelines in a way that is useful and practical, and can make their plans really good and get buy-in. And so we're having the fourth one of those on June 28th. We've had 3 so far. Their recordings are posted to our website. We also plan to have several topical stakeholder groups, by sector, to really get feedback on potential policies and pathways going forward. Our modeling will be complete in August, with a draft energy plan published in October. More opportunity for written comments and public hearings before our adopted CEP in January. And I'll just note throughout, we're really coordinating the stakeholder engagement with the Climate Council. We really recognized, Jane will talk a little bit more about that, but we recognized that we didn't want to reach out to 80% of the same people with 80% of the same questions. And so we're trying to align these efforts in order to be efficient and get the most productive and engaged feedback. And so with that's the high level overview of the energy plan. And I'll turn it to Jane to start to talk about the climate action plan.
Thanks, TJ. So afternoon, everybody. Jane Lazarchuk, it's wonderful to be here with you. And some of this may be a bit of review, but not wanting us to all start with a common baseline of where we're at. I'm going to walk through a little bit of background about how we've gotten to where we are with respect to the Climate Council and the passing of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So the Global Warming Solutions Act was made law last September. Based on that, the General Assembly had 60 days from enactment to make appointments. The Climate Council itself is the governing body now of the work associated with the Global Warming Solutions Act. That the Climate Council itself is composed of 15 appointments from the legislature, from the Senate and House side, representing various interests, as well as 8 administration officials. So based on receipt of those appointments, the first meeting had to be held within 30 days of those appointments, and the Climate Council met for the first time last November on the 20th, recognizing that we then had 13 months from that date to advance the work of setting up the other various components to do the work, the subcommittees and beyond, the staff. There was no staff associated yet with the Global Warming Solutions Act. I came on board in February of last year as the director. We have 2 more positions that we hope to fill over the coming months. The first being the Global Warming Solutions Act coordinator position, who will step on board next week, as well as ultimately also hiring legal counsel to advance the implementation of the climate action plan next year. So this is all moving us full steam ahead to the Climate Council adopting what we're calling the initial climate action plan by December 1st of this year. So Becca, you can move forward from this slide. So today I'm going to focus in a bit on both the structure of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Climate Council, but also speak towards the components that will make up the climate action plan, and hopefully be able to highlight what we have in common with the comprehensive energy plan and where the climate action plan is a bit different in focus. So similarly, to the comprehensive energy plan, the climate action plan is tasked with reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all of the sectors that produce them. So in addition to the comprehensive energy plan, looking at transportation, regulated utility, industrial, and commercial sources, we're also looking at the agricultural sector and non-commercial, non-energy emissions. We're also going to encourage smart growth and related strategies as directed by the Global Warming Solutions Act, and we're looking at achieving long-term sequestration and storage of carbon across all of our working lands and natural lands in Vermont. Next slide, please. We're also required to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 across all sectors. Just sort of a pin in that is that if we meet the emissions reduction goals, requirements set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act, we'll be net zero as a state roughly in 2030. So to say achieving net zero emissions by 2050 is actually a pretty small lift for Vermont. And so perhaps we'll think a little bit more about what we want to do beyond that as a state. We'll look to reduce energy burdens for rural and marginalized communities. That will speak to how we're doing our engagement and the subcommittees that we have in place to do that. We're also charged with limiting the use of chemical substances or products that contribute to climate change, as well as thinking about how we build and encourage climate adaptation and resiliency in Vermont communities and natural systems. What I will say is that the sort of three-pronged approach of thinking about emissions reductions, sequestration, and resiliency are the tiers of work that we're trying to accomplish in this climate action plan, recognizing that the emissions reductions are front and center for this first climate action plan because of the time constraints we're working under, and recognizing that the law has these statutory requirements for 2025 and 30 that are coming fast. The focus of this plan, while it has to address all of those things, will really be focused on advancing the policies and strategies that we need to come in line with that 2025, that first requirement that's on the books. Okay, next slide. So beyond the Climate Council, we have set up an organization to advance the work that includes a steering committee for the Climate Council that is in service to the Climate Council itself. So the steering committee thinks about agendas as well as coordination of the subcommittee work on behalf of the full Climate Council. It's composed of 2 representatives from House appointments, 2 from the Senate, and 2 administration officials. And we meet bi-weekly as a steering committee, whereas the council itself is meeting monthly right now. There's 5 subcommittees, 4 which were actually directed in statute, and then the Climate Council itself had direction in statute to set up any other subcommittees that they deemed as necessary. So we also established a Science and Data Subcommittee. The Rural Resilience and Adaptation Committee subcommittee is largely focused on resiliency planning. That bucket of work is looking at really right now 3 main areas around public health, infrastructure resilience, and resilience of our built landscape is what that subcommittee is focused on right now. Cross-sector mitigation subcommittee is the subcommittee focused on the mitigation strategies that we need to meet our emissions reductions. Just Transition subcommittee is thinking about how we move forward in a fair and equitable way as we decarbonize as a state. Focused a lot on setting and establishing the guiding principles that will inform all of the strategies and recommendations coming out of the other subcommittees, as well as thinking about and as is a touch point for how we think about co-creation and engagement in a more meaningful and hopefully a different way than state government has done in the past, which is really more of a react to strategies approach. I'll talk about that a little bit further at the end. And then our Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee, while largely I think about it as the sequestration subcommittee, the subcommittee thinking about strategies around sequestration, they're also focused on strategies and recommendations that look at emissions reductions for the agricultural component of the work, as well as thinking about resiliency of the natural landscape in Vermont. And so they're working a lot and closely with cross-sector and rural resilience, and I suspect there'll be a lot of overlap there. And then the Science and Data Committee, which TJ Poore actually co-chairs with Jared Duval now, is really in service to the other subcommittees in thinking about how we best do science and data collection across the subcommittee work, as well as inform the higher level climate science needed for the climate action plan, as well as the greenhouse gas inventory and other components of that work. So while the work of the council right now is really very high level and in support to the subcommittees, where much of that sort of detailed work and analysis is happening right now, that shift will start to happen in the fall, where the Climate Council itself will come back together in a more direct and deliberative fashion to take all of the work out of the subcommittees and translate that up into a climate action plan that they can all adopt by December 1st. Next slide, please. So there's luckily, and I think most of the subcommittees are following this pretty closely, there was a clear sequence of work that was laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act for the subcommittees and the Climate Council itself to follow and implement as we develop the climate action plan. First being not wanting to recreate, to actually pull together and think about existing programs across state government and then outside of state government that are actually working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions already. So whether their primary objective is greenhouse gas emissions, or it's another benefit of another program, whether it's a wetland restoration program to enhance water quality, which is also reducing greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. We want to inventory, collect, and have all of those programs in one place so that as we move and look to identify and analyze new strategies and programs as the second task, we know and build on existing programs and capacity that we already have within the state. There's also a clear objective to evaluate cost effectiveness of the programs and policies and strategies that we put out there. And that will be informed not only by our professional guidance within the subcommittees, but also by the modeling and work that we're undergoing with our consultants now. Unlike a climate action plan that just came out of Maine as an example of one that did a really good job of sort of framing the what, Vermont needs to go not only to the what level, but how we're going to do it. And I think that's a really key component of what makes this plan really actionable, so that as we move into 2022, we hit the ground running with implementation, because the subcommittees are not only developing high-level strategies, they're also going to be thinking about how we implement them. That will include developing financing strategies for the programs and policies and strategies they put forward. Then, of course, 4 and 5 just really speaks to the same kind of components that I just spoke to with mitigation strategies, but also similarly for resiliency and sequestration, we'll be doing the same kind of level of stepwise approach. And I just wonder, still recognizing the timeline that we're on, how far we'll be able to get to with the resiliency and sequestration component. And that's why we're really thinking about this as an initial climate action plan, recognizing that there's going to be more work to do in all of these buckets of work. Next slide, please. And finally, with respect to the work that'll come out of the subcommittees and ultimately be reviewed by the council, we're also going to be wanting to think about a monitoring and strategy for assessment of the programs and policies we put in place, so that as we pull one policy level over here, we understand the implications over here, and we can rejigger and make adjustments as we move forward into implementation. So that's one of the components of the work that we're engaging on with the contractors right now, and thinking about how we set up a monitoring framework for the work going forward. Finally, the subcommittees will make recommendations also to the council for what policies and programs that will need rules, and we're to be adopted by ANR, and we have to have those rules promulgated and adopted by the end of 2022. So that'll be an extremely fast timeline also for us to move right into rulemaking in the 2022 year. And again, not only do we have to adopt the plan this year, but we're obligated by the Global Warming Solutions Act to update that plan every 4 years thereafter. And some of the ideas that have been suggested to deal with this tight timeline, especially as it relates to the plan this time around for sequestration and resiliency components, is that perhaps this first plan will likely be updated more frequently than that 4-year component, so that we can get deeper into the resiliency and sequestration work that we know has so many multiple benefits to Vermont and all the other things that we care about in the state. And if we can't get to it in as much detail as we want to in this first plan in December, we can work to really think about a plan to move forward into that specificity that we want sooner rather than later. Next slide. So similarly to the slide TJ presented, we've been thinking about a climate action plan development timeline, and have these 3 main axes that are shown on this slide. The top one with the months called out is the identification of what's happening at the subcommittee and council level through the coming since last February and coming up until December and then into next winter. So the subcommittees weren't even formed until February of this year, and they hit the ground running this spring. That process to form those subcommittees and the composition of was a process that we engaged in with the council and with the Vermont public to ensure that in addition to the council and the composition of the council, that we sought out increased diversity with respect to geographic diversity, income diversity, BIPOC diversity, as well as complemented the subcommittees with the technical expertise needed to do the work. The strategies and recommendations at a high level are going to be coming out of those subcommittees in July of this year, of this summer, at the end of the month, in order to be informed by public engagement and the technical analysis. So we're expecting a full draft of the climate action plan by November, as well as a climate action plan that then is ultimately adopted in December and reviewed over the winter next year with the public for further refinement. Just because that final public engagement and consideration of the draft climate action plan won't come till next winter, we've been ensuring that there's been public engagement all along the way. Obviously, all our meetings are open. They have public comment. There's comment continuously through a public portal that we have up, as well as that membership that we thought about was integral to ensuring that we had diverse public representation on the subcommittees themselves. But we also have Climate Access and RISE as our consultants working with us on public engagement. And we're currently in this phase 1 of their engagement, which is really helping to frame the issues with the public, as well as using both one-on-one interviews and some roundtables to inform how engagement should happen, and therefore inform the public engagement plan that they're working on developing right now for us, and that will be presented to subcommittees and the council in mid-July. In addition to the public engagement contract, we also have Cadmus as our lead consultant for technical analysis. And they've assembled a team also working with ESG, Energy Futures Group in Heinsberg, UVM, as well as Harvard, to think about the components needed really specifically to the mitigation requirements of the law, but also thinking about the monitoring and assessment framework and the carbon budget, which looks at sort of a moment in time right now on how well we're doing with sequestering carbon, and hopefully sets up some future modeling for us to think about how we build out a carbon budget continually into the future. So we, as I was alluding to before people signed on, we literally just had our project kickoff meeting with Cadmus this morning. I'm really excited to move into the technical analysis and work really closely with the Public Service Department and their contract with SCI and NESCOM, who's handling the LEAP modeling, and coordinate all of our work so that both the Climate Action Plan and the Comprehensive Energy Plan are informed and based on similar technical analyses. So I'm going to turn it back over to TJ so that he can sort of drive home the theme on where we overlap and where we don't overlap between the Climate Action Plan and the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And then I'll come back and just talk briefly about public engagement opportunities for all of you to join in with us.
Great, thanks. So next slide, please. Yeah. Yeah, this slide really just attempts to summarize what you've heard in terms of there's a lot of overlap between these two efforts. But the legislature decided to keep the Comprehensive Energy Plan and add the Climate Action Plan in recognition, I think, that they're two efforts that overlap, but they are distinct planning requirements. They're ultimately two different reports with two different goals, and one doesn't obviate the need for another. And they need to interact and inform one another. So really, the takeaways from this are that the Comprehensive Energy Plan isn't a climate change plan, and the Climate Action Plan isn't a comprehensive energy plan. The CEP is really needs to be consistent with and a key component of meeting the state's greenhouse gas reduction requirements, and it'll reflect some planning for impacts of climate change on the energy system, but it's not actually a look at Vermont's non-energy related greenhouse gas emissions or climate adaptation needs. Instead, the energy plan is more of a strategic vision and interpretation of broad energy challenges and opportunities. The Climate Action Plan, in turn, leads to more of a set of specific actions that can be taken on greenhouse gas mitigation, adaptation, resilience requirements. So the core areas of overlap here are, the ones you've heard through this presentation are meeting the greenhouse gas reduction requirements, energy sector analysis, public engagement efforts, and a focus on policies being equitable, which each plan addresses this broader scope, which you see on the left and right hand side. Lastly, I'll just note that it's not just because our two agencies work together or we've, as state government, recognized the need to be efficient. Our energy plan statute was actually changed by the Global Warming Solutions Act to require consistency with the requirements of the GWSA and the Climate Action Plan. At the same time, written into the GWSA, the Climate Action Plan is required to be informed by the Comprehensive Energy Plan. So there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship here, and we're coordinating closely, particularly on modeling and public engagement, and really core members of the energy planning team are actively participating in Climate Action Plan subcommittees and on the council as well. That said, they could have slightly different outcomes and still be consistent. They may have points of divergence. I don't want to oversell that these are going to be 100% aligned. We'll see where the process takes us. But at least in process-wise, we've recognized that it's in everyone's interest to have them aligned as much as can be, and then we'll see where this process takes us, and hopefully the action plan recommendations and the energy plan recommendations are indeed aligned. But just want to make it clear it's not a guarantee, I guess. So, and then how do we do that, and what's that process going to look like in terms of engagement? I'm going to just turn it back to Jane to cover the last slide here.
So for the Climate Action Plan public engagement, TJ touched a little bit earlier about the touch points or where he is with respect to the Comprehensive Energy Plan engagement. But I'll highlight that again here, as well as focus on this concept of co-creation, which is sort of in contrast to what I spoke to earlier, which is the more typical state process of like putting out ideas and having the public react to them. And so we're thinking about really intentional collaborative approach to innovation, design, and implementation of the Climate Action Plan. Recognizing that it's not perfect, and that inherently takes a lot of time, and time is of the essence, and so to speak, with the Climate Action Plan. So our intention here is to set up a process and recognize that our work with the public and Vermonters in general is ongoing, and we're setting a stage and building an infrastructure to continually work with the public, both through this initial development of the climate action plan, but also beyond as we think about implementation and then the long-term revisions to the climate action plan. So co-creation is not only about our work with the public, but it also ensures that we're continually communicating the needs and ideas and comments from the public with the Climate Council through our relationship with the Consensus Building Institute, who is our facilitator for this process, as well as with the subcommittees who need to understand what we're hearing from the public in a timely manner to incorporate into their thought process around their strategies and recommendation development. So we're thinking a lot about these touch points that we're calling them with respect to how we talk with the public, and then how we circle and bring that information back into what we're learning and developing as a council. So as I alluded to, we're in phase 1 right now, which is really about community engagement and audience analysis. There are 3 main components of that work. There are interviews, one-on-one interviews that are intended to be with at a minimum 15 people, but up to 20 people that speak to and try to engage folks that are not typically engaged in these processes, so that we can learn from them about what it would take to get them engaged in this process. We also have 2 roundtables to accomplish the same thing. One as a specifically focused on a BIPOC roundtable that would be an infinity space, so that creating a safe space for folks to come in and speak to us about their concerns and issues, and again, raising and elevating the way that folks like that want to engage with us. And then we also have a sector-based roundtable. So trying to hear from a diverse and at this point, and some level of folks who are typically engaged, people who will be impacted by the decisions and recommendations put forward in the climate action plan. That phase 1 engagement is happening now, between now and the end of the month. With the intention of a public engagement plan being co-developed with learning from that and presented to the council and the subcommittees the week of July 12th. Everything's very dialed in, like it has to be that week. So the week of July 12th, in order for us to then move into the phase 2 development, which is really around sort of pre-draft input. So we won't have a complete climate action plan. We won't be really anywhere close because we won't even have much of the technical analysis back yet, but we will have sort of some input from the public, as well as sort of the high level considerations of what the strategies are that we know will be some component of the climate action plan. And so the intent is for those strategies and recommendations to come out of the subcommittees by the end of July. And then phase 2, which is implementation of that public engagement plan, to move forward. That will happen at many different levels. It'll include a launch of a website for the Climate Council. It'll include more roundtables, more intentional engagement at many different levels, the development of collateral, outreach materials. It'll also be very coordinated stakeholder engagement with the Public Service Department, specifically on the sectors where we overlap. So transportation, buildings, thermal, and the electricity regulated utilities, to think about how we both engage and get technical expertise and ideas around the strategies and recommendations, but then how do we also bring more people into that conversation? And we're hoping that the community engagement and audience analysis happening now will help inform what stakeholder engagement looks like for the summertime for us. Phase 3 will be roll out of the initial plan, and that will happen after the plan is adopted in December, which is why we're calling it an initial plan, because while there'll be engagement all along the way, there'll need to be refinements made to that plan based on what we hear next winter. And then we also have a partnership with respect to Climate Access and RISE to help us roll out the final plan, which we expect next March, with just ongoing communication and implementation strategies as we think about how to work with Vermont to implement the climate action plan, which will be rather ambitious. So I'll pause there, recognizing that I'm sure there's questions around the schedule and questions around the presentation, and happy to move into that component of the webinar.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, TJ. I think there are a lot of questions and some ideas too, which I think is really important to underscore, is that, I mean, this is a moment to get people's ideas and recommendations and thoughts about both the process, but also the strategies and the recommendations as well. So we have just a little bit, there are a lot of good questions. I have a couple of other questions as well. And I think, you know, I just really appreciate the update from you all. I mean, I think it is a tight timeline, but thank goodness we have a foundation upon which to build 2, you know, iterations of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, 2 former climate plans, and a lot of work and a lot of really great thinkers that are on this call and partners in the state of Vermont in general. And I think what's really different about this moment is now the Global Warming Solutions Act has essentially required the state to make progress because of the tight timeline that the climate science says. You know, we need to act to reduce our emissions and do our part when it comes to climate action. So this is an iterative process, and there will be many more opportunities beyond today for you to participate and help shape that plan. But the Climate Council, of which I am one of those members, is operationalized within state government. And so this is a focus for the long haul. And so it's a really important opportunity. And there are lots of questions I want to make sure that we are getting to from you all in this moment. Some of them are sort of comments. One, I'm going to try and go influence. Okay, so from Kimberly Hayden, does the LEAP account for emissions outside of the boundaries of Vermont caused by consumption of energy in Vermont as required by the statute? TJ, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so right now LEAP is structured to be consistent with the climate inventory as published with ANR. And I'll just note that the Science and Data Committee of the Climate Council is reviewing the methodology for the with Cadmus, the technical consultant, getting recommendations, and the committee will make recommendations on the inventory for potential improvements to that. So, you know, at which point do you measure emissions? Questions like how should you treat biomass? How should you treat large hydro has specifically been called out. And LEAP is flexible enough to, if the Climate Council, this is one area that, you know, emissions treatment is not traditionally in the wheelhouse of our office at the Department of Public Service. And this is one area where if the Climate Council moves forward and goes in a different direction, LEAP is flexible enough to accommodate a different direction there.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to try to get to the questions. I think some of the questions are also like really good comments that I think are really important food for thought and recommendations to weave into the subcommittee and council work in general. I would also note that a lot of folks on this call and are working at the local level as energy committee leader members and others. One from Will Dodge asks, at what level of granularity will the GWSA final technical reports be providing information? Again, for example, we'd be able to identify at a municipal level how many EVs need to be purchased each year, how many residential commercial units need to be weatherized, you know, how many kilowatts of new solar. So can you speak, TJ and or Jane, to the level of granularity you think will occur in this moment and what that might look like over time? And let me just lop on something to that. You mentioned the LEAP model being more flexible than past models. So I'm curious how you think that model, like speaking to Will's question, might be harnessed to get to iterate over time.
Right. So I can take that first, Jane, and you can chime on because I'll speak to it from the modeling front. Is that so? The initial modeling is going to be complete in the August timeframe, with some opportunity for feedback through the council after that. But that will all be on a statewide basis, and then following that, then we will try to break that down into as small of segments as we can. And what that means is looking at data in terms of residents, the number of vehicles registered, et cetera, in those towns, and you could then apply kind of statewide targets and kind of apply them proportionally. In addition, if certain towns have better data or other areas they want to focus on, there may be areas where we could, have those targets be specific to a town or regional planning commission. I don't want to oversell that, though. A lot of the data is hard to get at a granular basis, and so one of the things we're doing in this process this year in both the energy plan and the climate action plan is really trying to identify where the gaps in that data are. And how do we fill those gaps going forward? As we've said, it's going to be an iterative process. So that next year, while we still have the model, we're going to still have now have the internal capabilities. We can better allocate that and give towns and municipalities, planning commissions, better tools to plan going forward.
That's great. The only thing I'll just speak to perhaps is, because it's fresh in my mind from this morning, is talking about the economic modeling and the level of granularity we'll have there. And we're thinking about just being able to model 2 different regions of the state right now with respect to how we look at the economic impacts of the decisions we make. And we're thinking about somehow using zip codes to look at sort of rural versus urban being the I-89 corridor, to understand the difference of the impacts on the decisions we make at that level. And then perhaps just while this is outside of that question, I'll just say, because there's some questions directed right to me that then can go to everybody around sequestration. And if I misrepresented it on working lands only, I didn't mean to do that at all. The Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee is thinking a lot about natural lands as a sequestration component as a large component of the sequestration capabilities in Vermont.
Thank you, Jane. And actually, quick moderator's prerogative. I had a question about that. Can you just put a finer point on the sequestration component? I mean, you noted that Vermont could achieve net zero by 2030, but the statute actually does require hard pollution reductions, so mitigation strategies up to 80% by 2050. So will you just clarify what you meant by that for folks? Because I want to make sure it wasn't.
Yes. So because there are these intermediate statutory requirements for emissions reductions, if we, which we will, I'm sure, make our 2030 statutory requirement of being 50% below 1990 levels, we will be net zero effectively based on how much we sequester carbon currently in the landscape and what we're losing. And so like reaching net zero by 2050, what we will actually be sequestering more carbon than we emit by 2050 if we were to put and maintain policies that maintained our current landscape. So I think what we will want to do is actually put policies in place that conserve, enhance, and our agricultural lands, our working lands, as well as our natural lands, so that we may come up with a strategy or recommendation that we actually be net negative by 2050, not net zero, right? So and trying to figure out where we want to be for sure as a climate council will be really important. But in the negotiations around the Global Warming Solutions Act, that was one of the components that our agency was discussing with the legislature. Like net zero by 2050 isn't kind of meaningless because we'll be there with respect to the emissions reductions that you said.
Thanks, Jane. So there are a couple of questions related to some specific strategies related to sort of lawn mowing equipment and electrification and transitioning and engaging with the realtors and sort of builders and building codes. Those are all really important ideas and recommendations. And as a member of the council myself, I would just say those are exactly the things that I hope you are actually like. This is a moment where we can share those recommendations. Jane and TJ are hearing them, but we can share them more broadly. And I hope that when the CEP has their public engagement forums and when the Climate Council provides opportunities for you to weigh in, weaving those recommendations in, that will be a very important moment to do that. But I want to enable the opportunity, Jane and TJ, for you to offer any insight related to some of the questions related to those particular strategies as well. I haven't read through them all, but I echo everything that Joey just
suggested, and suspect that many of you will have a lot of expertise and ideas and around when we do stakeholder engagement, and hope that people will plug in, if you haven't already, to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, where many of these strategies and ideas sort of resonate on a more ongoing basis. And know that at the meeting last week, transportation and non-energy strategies at a high level were presented, and at the meeting not this week, but next week, we'll hear some ideas in the buildings and thermal and electricity components of the work. So again, encourage folks to dive in there. And this tension around like how specific we get in the climate action plan and how much comes later, I think is something that's still sort of playing out with all the subcommittees about how much time we have in order to get it to that implementation component with respect to the specificity that you are asking for in your comments. And I know that many of the subcommittee members and council members want to see in the climate action plan as well. So,
yeah, I would echo that. Thank you on the policies, and also just say, as regard to specific policy A or B, we don't know yet. We're not presupposing any solution, and really they're all great suggestions, what I skimmed in the chat, but also to the extent that folks have ideas on how we should evaluate policy trade-offs between those. Should we be focusing on the impact to customers, and which customers? Should we be focusing on the impact to Vermont economy? Should it be society as a whole? And how do we value that? I think we'll be looking for some input in those areas as well in order to help us shape that strategic vision going forward. So then, the answer on codes may be something now, and there might be something that happens in a year or two that really makes us think about things, or changes the economics of codes or whatever it is. And then how do we evaluate that so our energy policy is flexible enough to accommodate that change while still keeping us on the path to meet our targets and requirements. So really, thank you for providing those in the chat and more. Please, as much as you're willing and able to provide. Thank you.
Thanks, TJ. So I'm getting a couple of questions. I'm going to fear we're not going to have enough time to get to them, but just the difference between like the scale in terms of state level analysis and like local level analysis that may be helpful. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I thought I might just end with, if you could speak to both this question related to public engagement. Again, knowing a lot of people here in Vermonters have been very deeply engaged, care a lot about this, want to be engaged, help answer those important questions you just raised. Linda asks about sort of ensuring the public engagement and feedback is embedded on an understanding of the science and the why we're doing this. And she recommends deliberative polling. I guess if either of you want to close out with any further thoughts related to those two things, like the local versus the state and the public engagement component.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about local versus state, and then Jane, you could talk about public engagement. I think we're starting at the state level and want to drill down as far as practicable and useful into the local level, and possible in the time frame that we have. And so, to the extent that it is useful and that folks on the call or elsewhere have identified implementation challenges with the past energy plan, understanding what those are and how the broader energy plan can be useful to help address those barriers or challenges would be really helpful. So we want to get as far down as we can, but recognizing that sometimes data is not available and sometimes it's not actually useful to get that granular with a state plan. And so I guess I will leave it at that.
Thanks,
for that
TJ.
piece.
yeah, I think TJ hit it on the head with respect to how far we want to get to and finding that balance. And I'll just say the deliberative polling comment question is something that our consultants have discussed with respect to a tool to use with for how we put out the plan itself come next winter. And there's a lot of other sophisticated surveying and online tools that they intend to use that's within their contract. And I'll just say that it's extremely multifaceted. I expect it will continue to be how we engage with the public. And as we step out of COVID and back into meeting in person, I hope that will just increase our opportunities to engage with the Vermont public, both in this digital forum that we'll continue to do, but also provide new and exciting opportunities to come and meet people where they are and hear from them with respect to their comments and inputs for the plans and what they want us to be thinking about. So we're really committed to public engagement. It feels like a full-time job just thinking about how we're going to do that and learn from that, both for this process and for future state processes.
Jane, thank you. That is the perfect way to end this call and this conversation, to say we also are really committed to public engagement, doing our work both at VNRC and with the network of town energy committees, VECAN. We shoved a lot into 1 hour. I thank you so much, TJ and Jane, for the work that you're doing, for your time today. I thank everyone who joined us today. We had about 80 people on this webinar. We will share it. We will share the presentations. Thank you to TJ and Jane for making them available. And it's highly likely we will organize something again to lean into either both of you or some others also doing this really important work. So it is 1:02, and I'm really appreciative of everyone's time and all you all are doing, because this is really big, important, hard work. We can do it. There's lots of opportunity in it, but it's going to take all of us. So stay tuned for further public engagement opportunities and an ongoing conversation. And hopefully we can get your answers to some of these questions in other ways. So thanks so much again, you guys. Really appreciate your time, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for having us.